All right, so I believe we are rocking and rolling, everybody. Hey, let me just retweet the retweets, and we are ready to rock and roll. So, that's me. That happens. It's going on now. Great, perfect. All right, so sorry about being a little bit behind again here this afternoon. I wanted to finish something as a special treat for you guys, and it took 5 minutes longer than I thought it was going to take. So that's on me. Hey, I'm going to start doing a stream called Disorganized Streaming, and you all just tune into the same show. So, hey, it's great to see everybody. Thank you so much for joining me. Thanks for your patience. Let's get this show on the road. So, today we're going to do a recap of what happened, and we're going to talk about the Poisoner's Lair, which is essentially a replacement set of encounters that I threw together to replace some of the encounters that take place in the Cloud Castle and Zephyros' floating Cloud Castle, because as we talked about last time, I felt like they were a little redundant and maybe a little bit out of character and not as interesting, or at least I wanted to give my players a more interesting opportunity to explore the dripping caves. They were intent on going back, they had reasons to go back, and I did not want to make that just like a hand wave. Hey, there's 2 rooms and they both sort of stink. So, or at least for what level they are, right? So that's what's going on. Yes, Fawquad points out that we're streaming with Broadway Tom Lommel. You guys missed out on a true treat. In some respects, I'm a little sad that I don't stream the actual play of this because I sang my way through an entire TPK last night. Oh, it was a joy to behold. All the players were looking at each other like, how did we get stuck at this table? So that's fine. Good, it was a good time. Let's get into the recap. So when we last left our desolate party here, and I did make a map for this point of it. Yes, I did. How charming and crude. All right, so when we last left our party, they had been put between a rock and a hard place here, where they had 2 Duergar behind them. They're squeezed into this hallway, and there was 1 Duergar that had gone up around the corner, and no one was really sure exactly where they had gone or what had happened with those people, right? So that's fine for them. So we picked up where we left off. Now, the way that the initiative order dropped out was the cleric was at the top of the order, and then it was monsters. So cleric goes, I don't remember what he did. He's got a spiritual weapon rolling. That's about the only notable thing that you have to keep in mind here. The cleric goes, does his thing. Actually, he did something very, very clever. So he cast Minor Illusion. There was darkness here where these 2 Duergar are. Like, they had dropped a darkness spell. Like, okay, we don't want them throwing stuff at us or targeting us or whatever. So the Shadow Monk used one of his key points to drop a darkness spell, and they were in there. And the Gnome Cleric, I swear this guy either wants to be a druid because he talks to animals all the time, or he wants to be an illusionist. I'm not sure which. He uses Minor Illusion to create the sound of him saying, "You guys will never catch me!" And the sound of footsteps going out of the cavern, or the complex here. Now that was fine and fun. I had the monsters roll, and they did not. They suspected that didn't make sense because they're size large, and they didn't feel anybody brush past them. So I did, per the spell, have them use an action to detect, like, was that a real thing, or was that fake? And then the guy made his wisdom save or intelligence save or whatever it was, and was like, that's impossible, and so he charged forward. At the same time, that did burn one of their actions, so that was good. And, these Duergar, when they're size large, they're doing 2d6 plus 4 on a hit, and if they can stay together, if they can pack up, then they're doing 2d6 plus 4 and they're hitting with advantage, right? So it's interesting when they're maxed out and using appropriate tactics. I think they're tougher than the CR2 that they're actually rated at. I was using the Stone Warden or Stone Guardian or whatever it is variant from I think that was in Out of the Abyss. So I pulled those stats out of there. So they're a little tougher. They had 39 hit points instead of 27 or whatever. And, you know, if they can hit, they hit hard. My dice were cold, frozen cold. Like, I swear, like, the dice that I got at Gen Con must have been, like, the player special because they roll nothing but, like, 5s and 7s. It happens. That's fine. It comes back to pay off later on. Stick with us, folks. So they sort of waste an action like, hey, what was this? The other Duergar ends up kind of backing up because he hears, release Flame Spindle. And to the right of this big Duergar in the center of the intersection was the Dwarven Ranger. And those two doors open up, and a red dragon wormling comes out and breathes fire for 76 on that dude. He made his saving throw, but he still took like 10 or 12 points, and that dragon like crowded them into this hallway. It worked basically exactly the way that I expected it to, right? So I figured we're going to get them in a squeeze box, and then we're going to push the dragon on them and just, you know, grind them up. Put them in the corner. That's the way it worked. So they ended up kind of fighting this. A bunch of them ended up going down to the very top intersection and fighting the Duergar up there. The other Duergar sort of charged forward. The dragon came pushing in behind them. So they're sort of like fighting this weird, like, it's not a retreat because they're going deeper into the complex. They're going after that Duergar. He calls for backup. The priest who was on the other side, who had unleashed the cage that was containing the red dragon wormling, that priest goes around the corner and starts healing the guy who's basically the leader. So they're pushed up all the way in this top intersection up here. They're pushed up in there, and then they weren't taking a ton of damage because I was missing a lot, but they kept tanking on the guy who was standing next to the priest, and so they'd tank on that guy for like 12 or 15 points, and then his priest, you know, companion behind him would go, oh, okay, here's a cure wounds, second level cure wounds for 15 points. Like, they were not doing any damage, but in the meantime, they're taking damage as the Duergar are advancing on them. The dragon, the Shadow Monk is trying to tank the dragon basically alone. That is trouble. They managed to kind of like focused fire on the dragon and take him out, but they got so worn down. Eventually, the Duergar priest behind the bad guy here. So they took one Duergar down, they took the dragon wormling down, which good. Like, they don't want to take 7d6 of fire damage on a regular basis. That's not good for them. I did catch the Dragonborn Sorcerer shooting a firebolt at the dragon, and I'm like, oh, how much damage did you roll? I don't care. I'm immune to fire. Take that. So that was a nice, snotty moment of GMing. So they get pushed back up there. At some point, the priest is like, you know what? It's better for me to cast Spirit Guardians and force them back than it is, you know, if they're gonna tank on my guy, I'm gonna pop Spirit Guardians up in addition to my spiritual weapon and get some range damage on them, make them pay to stand their ground, which they did not do for very long. The monk kept going down, and then the gnome cleric would bring the monk back, and then the Duergar would turn around and be like, oh, you're awake again? Thwonk. And, you know, and because the guy's prone, he's got advantage on that roll. He's not going to miss the monk. So the monk went down, I want to say, he went down twice, they brought him back twice, and then the third time that he went down, they sort of left him until it got to this weird situation where they had killed two of the Duergar, and it was basically the guy and the priest left, but they realized, like, we've got to... There was one Duergar in the back here, and there's two priests, and they decided, we're too far backed up. We've got to fight some sort of retreat. They started disengaging and trying to move back down the hallway. And they managed to take that Duergar out that was kind of blockading their exit out. But at that point, the fighter rogue had gone down. And you think my dice are cold? We come around to the top of the or to his point in the order. Roll a death save, natural 1. Crit fails it. That's two death save fails right there. He's 2/3 of the way to being, sheet dead, or at least AL dead, out of the fight dead. They basically abandoned him, and so the dwarven big bad and his priest companion pushed their way down the hallway. They finally decide to focus fire on the priest, who, has the spirit guardians thing going, and blah, blah, blah. The priest only has 27 hit points. They managed to do 30 hit points in one round and take the priest out. Well, suddenly the tides turned. The Duergar ends up taking off to the side, and then they're like, okay, well, I'm going to use I think he had one last Cure Wounds left, so he raised the Shadow Monk and got him back in the fight. The Shadow Monk has a move of like 60 or something crazy. Like, he has a move of 40. So he catches up to the Duergar as the last Duergar is running away. They tie him up. They have some back and forth. They trade blows a little bit, but that guy's not recovering. And finally, everybody kind of rushes forward, pins him in, and they extinguish him. He is vanquished. So that's a very short version of this entire fight, because this fight essentially took most of the night. So the fighter rogue had crit failed his first death save. I come back around. Nobody's close enough. They had retreated far enough down the hallway. Nobody's close enough to get back to him and still have an action. I'm like, you got to make one more death saving throw. Crit fails again. That's 4 failed death saving throws. I'm like, you're dead. He's like, I know. No, I'm gonna go get a soda. Like, that was not like, I probably could have been more of a jerk and either like coup de grace him or something brutal like that. But no, his dice made him pay the price, which, given the number of misses that my dice had deployed, it was kind of like karmic justice. They were down the Bard. I thought they were going to be able to handle this a little bit better, but it was a combination of being down one character and some suboptimal tactics on their part, where that priest kept healing him up, and nobody would do any ranged attacks on the priest, and so it was that prolonged the fight a lot longer than I thought it was going to go. They fortunately... So, Adventurers League has one rule which I don't really agree with. I don't like the style of it, but up to level 4, if you get if you get killed, you can get rezzed for free by your faction. So if you're a Harper or whatever, you just send word to the Harpers, hey, one of our agents got dropped in the line of duty, and they will provide the raised dead for free. But the caveat that's attached to that is you're not allowed to get any XP from that session, like anything that happens that night, or maybe it's just anything that happens up until that point that you died, which, would have been quite a bit of it. And I feel like that's overly harsh, but I guess it keeps guys from doing something just like wild and stupid and then getting free reses for the first 4 levels. But I'm like, you're so squishy at the first 4 levels, like, who cares? They avoided that penalty by culling together the 1,250 gold pieces as it is to pay for the raised dead. And if you pay the money, then you're entitled to get the XP for the evening. So it worked out. I felt bad that the guy died, but honestly, like, the way it was looking, they had 3 of their 5 characters were down, and the gnome cleric and the sorcerer were fighting this retreat, and they both had about 18 hit points, so they were not in a good way. and so they managed to take out the priest, and then that turned the tide, and the leader was like, oh, I'm not going to go 1-on-2 on these guys. I'm going to try and escape. And that gave them the opportunity to get the monk back in the action. Then it was 3-on-1, and things were reasonable and under control. So that's how they recovered. So that was they went back to town. I basically said, you know what, it's been long enough in town that they have sent word to Waterdeep. Please send someone to help us. A cleric of Lathander showed up to rebuild the burned down temple to Malikian and Lathander that had taken place. And I just said, there's a guy there who can cast Raise Dead on your behalf. So not a problem. You can have that taken care of. Then they went back. They also found the 2 casks of ale that they had been questing for. So they found a letter, which I read to you last time, describing the fact that the Cult of the Dragon had imprisoned Jorgen and had taken his axe and sold it in Citadel Felbar. So they got an answer to what they were questing for. They found the 2 casks of ale. They went through the rest of the complex and found some treasure that I had not doled out from previous portions of the adventure, because just last week I got the certs for the items that we're supposed to hand out for launch. So they got most of that stuff. The secret door stuff really did not end up playing a huge role. They were in such rough shape with this fight, and especially down a character, that I did not play that up. They did find the sword in this pool that they ended up discovering kind of out behind the complex. So they found a tressum that had been it looked like the tressum had been abused, and the gnome cleric was all over that, like, oh, I want a pet, I want a friend, and make some animal handling checks, and they fed it and things like that, and that worked out. So they got the tressum, they got a blessing from the cleric of Lathander to go about on their adventures. They got some nice rewards. They got some money out of it. It worked out. So I feel like everything that needs to be deployed in Chapter 1 has largely been deployed. All we really need to do at this point is lay out the path forward to get them to Triboar and make sure that the hooks that go in there end up paying off. So we're probably looking at an overland journey. I just don't think I'll use the Cloud Castle at all. Probably that Cult of the Howling Hatred will just attack them maybe while they're traveling with Jorgen as he heads north. He's going to go on to Citadel Felbar, but I've decided the backstory here is we've got basically half Zents and half Harpers, and I've decided that the Harpers have been assigned to infiltrate the Zentarim. So that's why they were working with Chultan Helmstar of Helmstar's warehouse. That's why they got hired on for this caravan duty, to prove that they could be trusted. And they're going to go back to Waterdeep and essentially get another assignment from him. All right, take this stuff to Triboar and hand it off to our contact there, and he may have some more business for you to do. So that's basically the party's quest. Jorgen is going to travel along with them along the way, and then part ways with them once they get to Triboar. He'll show up, check out the monolith. Oh, it's still there? Great. And he's going to take off, and they'll part company, which is fun. So that's where we're at with the recap. It was a long combat session. I'm looking forward to getting the storyline advanced, getting them a little more juice. I wish that we had a firmer idea of when this season was going to end so that I could adjust my pacing accordingly. I feel like in some ways I've slowed down the adventure quite a bit by adding some of this extra dungeon crawl type of experience. But I also feel like the opening chapter is so rushed, where it's like you do a couple things and boom, you're another level. And you do 1 or 2 things, boom, you're another level. Like, they really put the screws to power leveling you up to 5 to get you out of Nightstone. And I have been enjoying laying the foundation for the rest of the adventure in Nightstone, because I feel like from chapter 2 on, everything is a lot of like, let's wander around to a bunch of different locations and discover different pieces of the plot and kind of collect them. Let's go to these burial mounds, let's go to this city, let's check with this person, we go to the Oracle, and then we got to go to these, so it just seems like the main theme to this thing is let's explore the Sword Coast, which is absolutely fine, but it would be, I feel like it's important in this opening chapter to give them a flavor of, here's kind of a home, here's the, let's not just kind of like snap, you're going to snap through enough towns and have the postcard version of what that town's about. Like Waterdeep is going to be maybe a half-an-hour discussion of like, okay, you show up at Helmstar's warehouse, is there anything else quick you want to do or buy? All right, great, you're on your way. That is massively depriving Waterdeep of its full potential, no question. So I feel like it's nice to take a little bit of time, let them get to know this place, really explore it, come to grips with some of the people, make some connections, even if those connections won't pay off for 3 or 4 chapters. At least we got our feet on the ground. We did something significant in one particular place. Let's move on to something else. I also would like to do some of the, when they get to Tribal War, I'd like to do the Zentrum quests that they hand out there before the big giant assault happens, because I think that's, again, like a way to get to know the NPCs in town and find out a little bit what's going on, because as it's sort of presented, you show up in the Giants attack, like that's kind of the way that it seems, and it's like, who gives a crap about all these people? Like, who cares if the Giants set fire to the barn? It does not matter. We can talk more about that on Tuesday. All right, it's 4:30. Let's talk a little bit about the Poisoner's Lair. So, the deal here, one of the reasons I started the stream just a little bit late, is I put a map together for you. So for everybody who's watching who has access to the Dropbox folder, which is everybody because this is not a Patreon backer-only map, I have put together what I call the Poisoner's Lair. Let me get rid of this other. So this is not exactly the version of the map that I used. It is similar. It has some of the same choke points that you might recognize from my discussion of how the combat went. But I wanted to give you a map that you could use in case you decided that you wanted to include this extension of the Dripping Caves, right? So along the bottom of the map here, we have basically like a 10-foot wide winding cavern that goes down to an open area. So there's a little bit of a cliff overlook and a wagon. That's where the party blew their stealth roll. There was a guard posted up top, and then there were 3 more guys downstairs loading a second wagon, right? So the one on the right-hand side, on the lower right, that wagon was filled with stuff from the poisoning and distilling operation. Okay? So this is where they had their first main combat. Those 3 guys below, the 1 guy up top. The 1 guy up top, they dogpiled, but by the time they dogpiled them, the 3 guys below hulked out into their full Duergar form, came walking up this thing, and invisibly, and ended up kind of like getting them in a bottleneck and pounding on them. So then they had the option to go left into these, kind of wander off into this natural cavern, and this essentially leads to a giant underground pool, which in my mind is sort of their water source, but also, like I described it, it's very murky, it's got some albino fish in it, and then when the party got there, eventually they came through the back way. When the party got there, Goblin Render, the magical longsword, was buried in the silt at the bottom of this thing. So the monk had to swim down and do some athletics checks to pull this thing out of the muck. And that was a fun little challenge. It was neat. They found this thing. There's only 3 people who are proficient with a longsword, and it feels like none of them want to use it. So I'm like, well, whatever. All right. I don't know if I can just change it to short sword. Like half the party is gnomes or something weird, right? So that's the area on the left. On the right, there's a covered pit trap that leads back into this area where the dragon is imprisoned, right? So you can see I've detailed some bars. There's essentially a cage where they keep the dragon. There's another set of doors that leads to this T intersection. So this T intersection is where the party got drawn in. A guy showed up, so right in the middle, a guy showed up at the northern end of this. They pulled in past the intersection, and the Duergar came out of the side passages on either side and filled in behind them. Actually, 2 of them were in this lab, right? This lab isn't exactly as I drew it as it was drawn in the previous map, but like I said, this is my custom version. So the very first room on the left here is the map. The very first room on the right, if you're coming from the south, is the dragon's lair. If we were to go straight up this hallway, that's the kitchen. If you look at this weird crinkly room in this corner right here, that's a shrine. That was a shrine to Tiamat. The room in between the kitchen and the shrine to Tiamat was the priest quarters. I had 2 sets of barracks for the other Duergar forces, and at the end room in the back is the boss of the complex. So Siddhartha, I can't remember what I named him, but that guy is the poisoner. He's the sort of the brains of the whole scheme. So you've got room here for basically, 4 to 6 Duergar, and then the priest and the head Duergar. So and the red dragon wormling. So it's like I said last time, it's very small. I don't like to have a ton of rooms because I just want to keep everything compact. I don't want people to do a ton of. I just don't want the exploring to get out of control because dungeon crawling can get really convoluted, and either I as the DM have to do a lot of drawing of, okay, then you go down this, and this is, see, now, wait, well, that was, so that's crenellated, so it goes like this, and then it goes like this, and then, like, unless it's an important and interesting structure, and I didn't think that I thought this was important, I didn't think it was necessarily super interesting. Well, no, I think it's important and it's interesting, but it's also fairly well contained. You can draw most of this on one battle map. Like, we explored most of this complex without having to leave my piezo flip mat. Once they went to the left, I'm like, you've killed everything, so I don't need to draw it out. I'm just going to describe it, or maybe do a little thumbnail sketch on the battle map. So, we're looking at 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 to maybe 11 areas that you really need to detail. Perfect, great. Like, that's compact. That's what I wanted to do. So at the last minute today, I decided I'm going to sit down, throw this thing together, and give you sort of an web enhancement, a bonus area for the Dripping Caves if you choose to use it. If you do, I'd love to hear about it. If you don't, great. Like, you want to keep the action moving, please, by all means, like, whatever works best for your party. So that's the Poisoner's Lair. I did not put furniture or numbers on this map. I may go in and touch up the detail now that I've scanned it once, and put in beds and maybe some disassembled lab equipment. I did draw the carts on there. I ran out of time, and I had to get in the little coloring and things like that. Remember we talked, I think it was last week, about art supplies. The shading in between the walls here are those beeswax crayons, and I was pretty happy with how that turned out. I didn't have a very fine tip on the one that I was using, but I didn't have too much bleed over going over the edge. I wasn't super happy with the markers that I used. that's me being a nerd. I also was using super cheap paper. So between those two things, I could probably use some, some decent Pigma, either Micron Pigma markers or whatever. Nerdy art supplies. So there you go. That's a free map. Again, just for you guys for anyone who's watching, anyone who enjoys. It's my evil ray of sunlight.
Oh, I was coming to get it.
All right, that's alleviated. So that is the Poisoner's Lair. I hope you guys get some use out of it. I think you can. The nice thing is you could probably drop this into any dungeon. And again, the setup here is they are evacuating. So that's what those wagons are for. They're packing up their stuff, and they're going to take off because they know it's a game over. There's no place for them to go. So fairly simple. The corridors are 10 feet wide rather than 5 feet wide because these guys can hulk out and become large-sized creatures. So that's why I made most of these rooms. Some of the corridors only have regular doors on them because they're not going to be in full large size mode when they use them. But I wanted to make sure that the hallways were full large size so they weren't squeezing when they moved down them. So a little insight there into how this complex came together. Yeah, that's that. So we have time for a little bit of Q&A since it's 4:36. We have about 25 minutes to talk about Q&A, what's going on. So if you guys in chat have any questions that you want to throw at me, I do have a couple of things that I got on Twitter that I would like to address, and but we have time to talk about things that you would like to talk about here live in the chat if you are so inclined. So the first thing that came up, let's just tackle this one Twitter question that came up, and it was, so Herms/Silver Sigfran on Twitter asked, how is Storm King's Thunder? Would it work for a fresh group new to 5th edition? I think it does work for a group new to 5th edition. I think it might be a little challenging where I would say in that respect, take your time on the 1st through 5th level thing. Because for a group new to 5th edition, I've talked about this a little bit in the past, but I don't think you should slam the throttle down and ram them from 1st to 5th in the space of 3 little, set-piece battles. I would not do that. I think the players need some time to learn their character abilities, to make some informed choices about what they want to play, to learn when they level up, like what are the implications? Is it better to take a feat, or is it better to take an ability score increase? Unless you're going to play with pre-gens right out of the gate from 5th level, I would say don't push super hard in the first chapter the way it feels to me like it's been presented. And, here's the thing. I understand why it's presented that way, because they want to get to the 5th to 10th level storyline, right? And also, this is the, 4th hardcover, 5th hardcover adventure for D&D 5. So I think they feel like we've covered the newbie ground, we've held everybody's hand. If people want to play starter adventures, they have opportunities to do it. So let's just get right into the thick of things. It's a little easier to design encounters for a 5th level party because the characters are not so fragile. So I understand why that design decision was implemented. I think for a 1st level or a party that's new to D&D 5, it behooves you as the DM to take a little more time with it. The other thing I will say is if you're new to DMing 5th edition, then go and do a little bit of extra reading and really find the pieces of the book that speak to you, and then focus your story around those pieces of the book. Like that's been my strategy in tackling this thing, because it is designed to be super modular, where they can go to Triboar, or they can go to Golden Fields, or they can go to Bryn Shander. You know, pick the one that you like. Well, that means there's, assuming you pick one that you like, there's 2 chapters of the book that you're not going to use. So it can seem a little overwhelming to it can seem a little overwhelming to people to sit down with that book and then read it and then read this and try and keep it all in your head. You don't have to keep it all in your head. Like, if you like what Bryn Shander does, stick with it. And if you don't want to give out all 6 quests, you don't have to, you know, at the end of Bryn Shander. If you don't want them to go to 5 different burial mounds, fine. Like, narrow it down to the pieces that you want. If you want them to attack one giant's lair, have at it. The other thing too is, like, you can dynamically include that stuff. You can have the adventure grow if you so choose. So there's no reason you can't give a hint, like, okay, well, you did a great job against Gub, the hill giant. That was a fun kind of goofball, sloppy fight. Let's go and take on, see if we can take on Duke Zalto or whatever. Let's go to the floating iceberg. So as a DM, you might feel a little overwhelmed, especially with that chapter 3, which is just like, here's the cities of the Sword Coast. Don't don't feel like you have to get in over your head. You're allowed to cut out the parts that you don't like, or ignore pieces that you just aren't, you can't manage with your time schedule or your organization or whatever. I will say, like, that's what I'm doing. I'm not going back and revisiting Bryn Shander very much. I'm not really reading the stuff on Golden Fields, because we won't have time to get back to it, and I've decided that Triboar is the town that my group is going to, so I'm going to put my energy and effort into that. Those pages aren't, like, if you're a new GM, those pages aren't wasted pages. You can always go back and go, oh, okay, these are an interesting way of presenting these hooks. This is an interesting set of encounters. This fight goes differently than what I would have expected. So you can kind of go to school on those things if you have the time. But there's a lot of this book that, if you really pare it down to the bare bones of what you need to get the plot out versus what's presented, you can cut huge chunks out of this book. And I think that's a deliberate design decision, so that it's got reusability and replayability, right? Oh, that was fun. I wish we could play it again. Guess what, guys? Like, you didn't go to 3 different giant lairs. We can play this again. I can drop these into my campaign without having them have anything to do with King Hecaton going missing and all that kind of stuff, right? So that's, I think it is well suited to a group that's new to 5e. There are some caveats that I would encourage you to keep in mind when you, if and when you pick this book up and decide to use it. Is it? I think it's a decent intro adventure, to be honest. I like the opening chapter. It has so much stuff going on that makes sense that I was able to flesh it out kind of beyond what I wanted to do. There was enough open spaces that I could plug stuff in. I do think it makes a pretty good intro adventure, as long as you maybe tie or do a little bit of pre-gaming, like a little bit of work ahead of time. Why are they going to Nightstone? I didn't think the hooks in the book were super compelling, but it worked out like that. So we've got probably 20 minutes left here for the XP. So if you have a question, please, I'm I should have time to address it. So that's I think to answer the final answer is I think this would be a great module to just pick up and run. You just have to do your work as the DM to make sure that you're giving your players a gentle introduction to 5e. Let them get their feet under them, whether they played something before or not. Like, there are some rules that are going to take a little bit of getting used to, and especially as you level up, if you power level those guys up, it's not. I don't think that helps. I don't think that helps the players. Rushing them to their destination is just not where you want to get. So that's that. The other question that I had. Let's go take a look at our YouTube comments. I read the comments sometimes. Can you believe it? Oh, who's this handsome guy on the front page of Saving Throws videos? Oof. So good looking. Eesh. Let's see if there's anything going on here. Stop. First of all. There was one comment I just want to pull off of YouTube, and I apologize for not having it here right off the top of my head. I think it was in episode 10. All right, that's not it either. All right, so Brian Corbile says, "Hey, I've been following your series. Very thankful for your insight. I'm GMing my own party through this module, and we also just finished Nightstone. In my group, I had Felgalos show up to save the party from the orcs in order to introduce him early. I really want them to have a reason to care about him later on. I also am going to use Felgalos as a means to introduce Harshnag to the party as well. I want to use Harshnag as a tie-in to Zephyros. I felt the Zephyros hook was very loose. I'm going to have Harshnag ask the party to check on the Icewind Dale on his behalf since he isn't very welcome there. My idea was to have Harshnag summon Zephyros and send them on their way and have him head off east. For Chapter 3, then, the idea is to have the party follow in Harshnag's trail, eventually meeting up with him in Yartar, and to go on to Chapter 4. If you have any thoughts, I'd love to hear them." So I did have a few Twitter exchanges with Brian, and I think this is a fine plan. So for those of you who have not read ahead and we're not quite there, Felgalos is, I believe, a bronze dragon, copper dragon. He's a metallic dragon who gets captured by the cloud giants, the evil cloud giants, and gets tortured for information about where his hoard is and where these caches of giant relics are. And it's a little bit, again, I agree that it does feel like you have this awesome dragon character who is just there, and who is grateful to the party for being freed, and maybe makes a good ally at that level, whatever level they are, 9 or 10 or 8 or 9 or whatever they are when they get to taking on the giant lairs. But I agree that there is an opportunity to introduce him early, have him befriend the party, and then bring him back, have him captured and under the influence of these other of these cloud giants. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad idea. So the one piece of caution that I gave this guy over Twitter, that I gave Brian over Twitter, was don't get too far down the road with your planning, right? Because as we've seen, no matter what you plan and how you want to foreshadow, if you make the pieces of your story start to interlock too tightly, then you find yourself in a position where you can't dynamically respond to the actions of the players. And really, you want to give the players the opportunity to shape the story in as much as they can in a pre-written adventure, right? So if you have this tight thing where it's like, oh, well, if they don't meet Felgalos, then this house of cards that I've created falls apart, you've done yourself a disservice rather than they've screwed you. Like, that's your own fault for not bringing pieces, not making those connections kind of flexible enough that you can not making those connections flexible enough that you can adjust on the fly and respond to the events that they bring to the table. Because that's the payoff, not necessarily for you as a DM, but that's the big payoff for the players, is for them to go, oh yeah, you know what? Because I gave, one of the cool things that happened this session is the Dwarven Ranger skunned the Dragon Wormling and then brought the piece of hide to Jorgen and said, I got you this big piece of dragon hide, maybe you can use it for something. And he's like, yeah, oh, maybe I'll use it for a cod piece, which was maybe a little crass on my part. But he could also like make a shield or make a hat or, make gauntlets out of it. Like, I was like, that is a cool detail that you have brought in and that I now want to have pay off either down the road or, in short order, whatever. Like, I need to incorporate that into my game. Likewise, when they make friendships, allies, they betray people, they have enemies, you want to be able to dynamically play off of that. So, don't get too far ahead of your story in terms of, okay, and then this happens, and then this happens, and this happens, and then this happens, and this happens. Because what you end up doing is you go, oh, in order to get to this piece over here, I've got to like wrench them hard, or they try to do something that you don't think leads there, and then you're like, oh, no, that doesn't work. And like telling players, the stream always wraps up when the mailman rings the doorbell. There's telling players that something that they can't do something is the best way to like kill player incentive to make things happen, right? Like they feel like what's going on? Like they feel like they're no longer creating the story with you, and they feel like they're just riding whatever story that you have crafted. At which point, like they don't feel like they have meaningful input other than, okay, well, since we're supposed to kill this guy, hopefully this combat will go well because clearly, he's got to die or whatever. It's you put yourself in a very dangerous position. That's one point, is don't get your plans too far out ahead of wherever you're at with the plot, okay? Secondly, I would say you're introducing two major NPCs, like, right back to back next to each other. So you got Felgalos, who's a dragon. That's awesome. And then you've got Harshnag, who's a frost giant. That's also awesome. But it might feel a little too Wizard of Oz. They just got the ruby slippers on, and all of a sudden, here's a lion, here's a Tin Man, Let's let them have a little breathing room with like who these awesome guys are. Otherwise, it might make them feel like a little bit too, like the spotlight is shining on them a little bit too brightly, right? That, oh, okay, apparently we must be super cool, even though all we've really done is rescue Nightstone. All of these people are showing up. One way that you could counteract that is Felgalos goes and finds Harshnag, and Harshnag is like, no, little people, they're so cute, whatever. He could kind of blow them off. But then you're running the risk that the party is like, oh, what a jerk. And that becomes an antagonistic relationship that you can't redeem. If you can redeem it, then great. Like, that could be all right. And if they then end up rescuing Harshnag, fine. On the other hand, if it's set up as an antagonistic relationship, and let's say they have an antagonistic relationship with Felgalos because he's a dragon, he thinks he's better than everyone. Well, when they find him tied up later, do they really have an incentive to help him out, or do they just let him hang, or do they, do something very mercenary and kill him for the XP? Because players will do that. Players will act in an immoral fashion, whether you like it or not. So keep that in mind, that you're putting your guest stars run the risk of outshining your series regulars, right? So, like, if you watch a TV show that's been on for a couple of years, The Big Bang Theory, not my favorite show, but they are known for stunt casting, right? So they might have George Takei come on and do a spot, but they don't have George Takei and Bob Newhart come on, or they don't have George Takei and Will Wheaton, because they want to give their cast some time to shine. So I would say be careful. You could almost have Felgalos like accompany them for a while. Ask them to go check into this Icewind Dale thing on the behalf of their buddy Harshnag, because he's already busy, but also he's an outcast. And then later, Felgalos can go, you know what? I don't know what happened to him. Can you go track him down? And then when they finally meet him, they're like, oh, dude, we've been hearing about you for the past 2 months. And then there's a payoff. So there's anticipation and payoff, rather than introducing both of those guys right away, and then neither of them kind of has a chance to shine or get built up in the players' minds, nor do the players feel like they've earned a position to be friends with both a dragon and a frost giant. So I like the idea. I would say there's an opportunity to keep it zoomed in a little bit, to keep the spotlight focused on the players and their one guest star. Don't explode the cast too big. All right, we've got about 10 minutes left. Since I started late, I'm going to go a little bit over. And for the XP, said, do you usually prefer to run modules, or would you rather homebrew an adventure? You know, it's funny because I was thinking about this the other day, and this has been one of the first times that I have definitively tried to run an adventure as close to the book as possible, like as close to what was written as possible. And prior to this, I ran When a Star Falls, and is it B2, The Lost City? Is it The Lost City B2 or is it B3? I don't know, The Lost City. So I ran The Lost City as an intro adventure, and then I ran When a Star Falls as the follow-up for my home campaign. And both of those I ended up modifying, not heavily, but significantly, I guess. Although I will say I ran When a Star Falls fairly close to what's in the adventure. But I will say, like, I struggle with wanting to tinker with it and put my spin on it, and wanting to polish pieces of the story that my party is bringing forward or interested in pursuing. But I also find it kind of a relief to have a roadmap of what's going to come ahead, because I have run a number of homebrew scenarios, which I enjoyed and was proud of being able to craft and explore elements of the game world that I didn't necessarily feel like I'd always wanted to explore. So when I ran the 5e alpha beta playtest before the game was officially launched, I got to do all of this stuff where I incorporated things from the Shadow Planes, and there were Githyanki on the Ethereal Plane, and there were we played the prehistory of the Temple of Elemental Evil, so the Battle of Emerald Meadows and all of this, explored all this Greyhawk lore and things like that. And that was super fun. It was great to pursue that and incorporate it and explore it. But it was very stressful every week to sit down and try and plan what was going to happen for that session, and have to churn out, start with a blank canvas or start with a third of a blank canvas and then fill in the 2/3 of the rest of the details. So I like putting my stamp of ideas on things, but I will say I have found it easier to take a homebrew adventure or take a pre-published adventure and then spin my own details and burnishing into it to hack it, essentially, right? And shine my particular vision onto the thing, which I think we've seen here, right? And I think that's the intent. Like that's the way Dungeons and Dragons is supposed to work. But I'm fairly happy with it. Now you have to have an adventure that speaks to you. If Rise of Tiamat wasn't your jam, then you got to find something else. The good news is D&D 5 is not particularly difficult to convert from older editions, although if you go back and crack open those older modules, like I am cracking open Expedition of the Barrier Peaks, and it's like, oh my god, like I don't know how people in the 80s pulled this together to actually run it, because it's a disaster in terms of organization and layout. It's really awful. On the other hand, I'm having fun converting it, right? So find the adventure that speaks to you. That's not hard to do. We've got 40 years of material to play with, from the published old school modules all the way to decades of Dragon Magazine and Dungeon Magazine, to systems like Pathfinder, to, if you're looking for, an adventure I really like from Dungeon World is Servants of the Cinder Queen. That really was eye-opening, the way that format laid things out. So you've got material to pull from, but give yourself a leg up. Don't feel like you have to be that authorial genius who's like, well, my ideas are better than everyone else. You're making a lot of work for yourself. In my life right now, I'm still disorganized. I'm still doing disorganized play, and I've got a 256-page book to lean on if I really need to. So make as Mike Shea, Sly Flourish says, be a lazy DM. Why not?